So context, again, matters in our story for today in this chapter of the book of Esther. Some of you may know that when the Jews celebrate their festival of Purim, they read the book of Esther during the festival. They read the whole entire thing. Purim, this festival, is built off of the story of Esther. If you just skipped a few pages in your Bibles towards the end of the book, you would see that it actually explicitly says this is what you should celebrate: the story of the deliverance of the Jews from the evil, wicked Haman. And so there's a direct connection here in the book of Esther to the Jewish celebration of the holiday of Purim. But if Purim is in the foreground of what we see here in the book of Esther, the background is all Passover. And Passover, you may know, is not just one of the highest points in the Jewish calendar, in the Jewish festivals and holidays. It's the day, though, especially that the Jews remember deliverance. They remember how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt and brought them into the land, the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. This is Passover. Passover is about deliverance, as we said, with a capital D. All the stories of salvation, all the stories of God delivering the people throughout Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, they all have their roots back in the Passover, the coming out of Exodus, or the coming out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. So every act of salvation, every act of deliverance in the Bible points in some very important way to Passover. Even Easter. Our Easter is this immense, intentional celebration of a new Passover in Jesus Christ. So Passover is at the core. It's in the background of all these stories in the Bible, especially here in the book of Esther. If you're a Jew and you want to talk about deliverance, you talk about Passover. So maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that Passover is everywhere here in Esther chapter 5. If you would, take a look with me. You have Bibles in the back of those pews. If you don't have your own, if you have a phone and you have the church app, you can look at it there. There's a Bible little icon at the bottom. Click on that and look up Esther chapter 5. And here's how chapter 5 begins. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be given to you." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." It's at this part in the story of Esther, here in the middle of chapter 5, that I tend to stop when I hear it. And I think, what? Why are you waiting, Esther? Your people are going to die. Get on with it. What's the deal? Why are you baiting this guy? Just tell the king who you are, and let's get this thing overturned. What's going on here? We don't need another banquet. People are dying out there, I think. Tell them who you are. Tell them who you are. But Esther doesn't. In fact, there are some things we have to look at before we even get to this point. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. I told you that Passover is super important, and it's super important also for understanding what in the world Esther is doing here. All right, Passover is all over this story right at the beginning of chapter 5. And here's why. So I'm going to ask you, because this is going to get a little bit back and forth with some of these books, to get a pen out or a piece of paper. You can write on your bulletins. You can write on the back of those prayer sheets. All right? And we're going to trace out how Passover is so central to this passage. So, back a few Sundays ago, back in chapter 3, verse 12, we heard this. We learned that terrible decree that Haman passes, the one that he puts together to go out and murder every Jew in the kingdom, every Jew in the world, we learned that he sent it out on a particular day. It goes out, the book tells us, on the 13th of the month of Nisan. The 13th of the first month in the Jewish calendar. So if we had a Jewish calendar in front of us, by the way, we would be able to see that instead of January, it would say Nisan up there, and we'd get all the way through here, and we'd be here on the 13th, and it would say, decree to kill all the Jews goes out. All right? That's what we have. And so on the 13th of Nisan, this terrible decree goes out, and things start to happen really quickly in Esther's story. After this, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, as we learned last week, he finds out about the decree. He works in the sort of capital, in the palace. He finds out about the decree, and he goes bonkers. He just goes crazy. He can't believe what he's hearing. He puts on sackcloth. He rubs ash all over his face. He starts to mourn and to repent. He starts to wail, the text says, outside the palace walls. And importantly, it's still the 13th of Nisan. Not even a day has passed since the decree has gone out, and Mordecai is there already wailing outside the walls. And when Esther hears him, she asks what's wrong, and he tells her, he says, Esther, you were born. We talked about this last week. You were born, Esther, for such a time as this. So go tell the king, tell him, plead on behalf of the Jews, save our lives from this terrible decree. I'm right with them. I'm like, Esther, why are you waiting, right? Do this. But Esther isn't sure. She's frightened. She's scared. She thinks, I don't know if I can do this. So she waits. She thinks about it for a little bit. She reminds Mordecai, that's not as simple as doing that, Mordecai. Don't you remember that there's this law that if anybody goes to the king uninvited, if you go into the throne room and he hasn't invited you, there's a law that says he can kill you right then and there. He can just strike you down. So if I go in and he doesn't want me there, I can die. She tells Mordecai this. She reminds him that there's a risk here, that he's asking her to literally put her neck out, stick her neck out for him. But after some back and forth, she agrees. This is what she has to do. She decides to go through with it. And what comes next is extremely important for getting this timeline of the book of Esther right. The first thing Esther does, and remember, we're still on the 13th of Nisan. The first thing Esther does after she agrees to go before the king and plead her case is she commands Mordecai and the Jews to fast. And she says, I want you to fast for 3 days. And me and my maids are also going to fast for 3 days. 3 days. 3 days of fasting. Now, where does that leave us when it comes to dates and a timeline to this story? This is why I had you get out that piece of paper. The decree goes out on the 13th of Nisan, so you can write that, 13th of Nisan. All right? On that very same day, Mordecai starts wailing at the wall, and Esther asks why and finds out why, and then she calls for a fast. And that fast is going to last how many days? It's going to last 3 days, right? 3 days. 3 days is important. 13th of Nisan. It's also important to remember something about how the Jews tended to count on their calendar. The first day when something started was considered day one. So the 13th of Nisan would be the first day of the fast. And she says, I want you to fast for 3 days. So the first day they fast is the 13th of Nisan. The second day they fast, most of you, I believe, can count, would be the 14th of Nisan. All right, so day 2, it's the 14th of Nisan. Day 3 would be the 15th of Nisan. This brings us to the start of chapter 5, verse 1, when we hear that on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. Now, what day would that have been in the Jewish calendar? The 15th of Nisan. And what is so special about the 15th of Nisan? Anybody have a guess? It's Passover. Esther begins to deliver her people on Passover. So what does this mean? Here, the book of Esther is cleverly telling us that what we have is a brand new Exodus. A new Exodus. Esther is going to bring deliverance to the Jews, a new Exodus to the people, deliverance with a capital D, a brand new act of God. Only instead of Moses leading the charge, it's now a woman, and she's not delivering them from slavery, she's going to deliver them from genocide. There's a big difference here, though, between the deliverance in Exodus in the original Passover and Esther's version right here. The first Exodus with Moses, it was big, and it was bold, and it was bombastic. There were plagues, and there were seas that were split in half, and whole entire Egyptian armies were destroyed. But here in Esther, there's just Esther. There's just Esther. But she's got a whole lot of power. And her power is far more subtle and way more crafty than anything Moses had. In fact, Esther's power here in chapter 5 sounds a whole like what Jesus in the New Testament will describe in the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 16. It's a famous passage when Jesus tells his disciples, he says, I'm going to send you out as sheep among wolves. So you should be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. I'm going to send you out as sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as servants and as innocent as doves. Those are Jesus' words. If Esther isn't a sheep in the midst of wolves, then I don't know what else we could call her. She's got both Haman and Ahasuerus to deal with. These are two of the most lascivious, callous, scared, vengeful people on the planet. But that doesn't mean that Esther is powerless. When Jesus tells us to be wise as serpents, he means we should be prudent. We need to be practical. This is why he talks about a snake. I've always found that weird. Why a snake, Jesus? Why a snake? We learned from Harry Potter that snakes aren't necessarily good. All right, so why is Jesus? This is a joke. Thanks. So why are you talking about a snake, right? I mean, we learned from Genesis 3 that snakes are bad, right? We don't like snakes. Snakes in the Bible have an overtone of this is not good, but Jesus says be a snake. So why does he say be a snake? Why is a snake a metaphor for wisdom? Let me take a shot at it. A snake, if you think about it, is actually a really vulnerable animal. I remember the first time I saw my mom just go out. She grew up on a farm, but I didn't live with my mom when she was ever on a farm. All right, and most of the time, my memories of my mom are making like cinnamon rolls and pies and things like this. Well, one day she's working out in the yard, and all of a sudden I see her with this hoe, and she just like is railing on something. I go over there, look, and there's this big old black snake that she had just like took its head off in one swing, and I thought, wow, that's my mom. I was scared. But the point is that snake had nothing on my mom, right? It's really hard to pounce or do anything when you don't have any legs or hands or arms, right? A snake slithers on the ground. A snake, if you think about it, is pretty vulnerable. It has to hide, it has to blend in, it has to wait, it has to watch before it can really do anything. That's where the snake gets its power from. Most importantly, a snake has to understand its situation. The snake my mom took out didn't understand its situation. All right? I didn't even understand what I was dealing with. All right? This was something new. All right? So the snake has to understand its situation. It's got to know where it is. All right? It has to know everything and everyone around it. It's got to pay attention if it's going to survive, especially if it's going to thrive. A snake has to be wise like this. It has to be practical and prudent. It has to adapt to its situation. Sounds a lot like Esther, right? We're in the same boat as Christians, Jesus says. We need to pay attention to the people around us so that we can understand who's around us and we make sense of our situation in life so we can figure out the best way of using what we have to change the world for the better for each and every one on this planet. That's what it means to be wise as serpents. It means to pay attention to be prudent, to understand who people are and how they think and what's going on in their lives, and then pour into that with that understanding. But what about innocent as doves? So we talked about wise as serpents. What about innocent as doves? Jesus is obviously not saying we need to be weak. That's not what innocent means here. The word innocent actually means unmixed or untainted in this passage. It means to be free from evil, unmixed by it, untainted with it. All right, some power we just know is toxic. Some power is just toxic. We can't let it touch us. Not all power is good. So to be as innocent as doves, it has nothing to do with being weak or being naive, and yet it has everything to do with being good. Just think back to where we've already been in the story of Esther. We've already seen her decide not to use her power for herself, but to use it for her people. And by saving her people, we're going to come to find out she's actually going to be saving the people of Persia as well, because they're all about to be guilty of committing genocide. And she's going to stop them from doing that. In Esther's words, in other words, her power, in other words, is an innocent kind of power. It's a power used to help and to serve. But let's talk about specifics. How is Esther both wise and innocent in this new day of deliverance, this new Passover here in chapter 5? The first thing we notice, if we go back to the text, is that Esther doesn't go about it alone. This isn't just her power. She's asked all the Jews in the city, including her cousin Mordecai, to fast with her. Esther sets out on this new day of deliverance with hope. It's not just her hope, though. It's the hope and it's the strength of her people. And not just her people, it's the hope and the strength of her God, too. After all, we're talking about a fast. Again, I can't help but get glimpses of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane right before he dies. Do you remember how many times Jesus prays? 3 times. 3 different hours. Jesus goes up there to pray for 3 hours, and he takes 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he begs them, pray with me, he says. The idea seems to be that their prayers will strengthen everyone. They'll strengthen themselves and they'll strengthen him. If you've ever played sports or taken a difficult, exam or gone in for surgery or just done something that you need some backup, you need some people praying for you, you need somebody behind you who's got your side, right? They've got your back. This is important. You know how powerful it feels to have people there with you. People supporting you, backing you up, even if it's only in spirit. Esther has this in spades right now. We also find out in verse 1 that Esther is not afraid to leverage the tools that she already has at her disposal. What does the text say? On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes, and then she went and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. Esther takes on the power of queen. It's nothing compared to King Ahasuerus, but it's not nothing compared to everything else. She takes on the power as queen. She'd be a fool not to take advantage of that. In fact, as Mordecai told her last week, it may be precisely helping out the Jews, keeping them from being annihilated, may be precisely why she was made queen in the first place, so that she would be in a position to intercede for them in the whole entire kingdom. Esther takes on the power of queen, but I think there are 2 things in this chapter besides this power of the queen, and then besides also the hope and the power of the people that she has fasting with her, that the text points out are really important for understanding how does Esther take power in this situation, and especially how is she wise here in chapter 5. And the first one is her ability to understand just whom she's dealing with. Esther knows what King Ahasuerus thinks. She knows what makes him tick. She's got the measure of her man. I don't even know where that phrase came from, but it feels like a song. All right? But she's got it. You can see that if Disney was making another Esther movie, then this would be, I'd be like, hey, a measure of your man right here. Let's put that one in there, okay? She's got the measure of her man. Esther's like Jesus' snake, all right? She knows her surroundings well, and she's able to navigate them like this master chess player. And Ahasuerus has no idea what's coming, all right? He's just led around. This guy, he just doesn't get it. So what does she know? Well, we can see it in what she does. She throws a banquet. If there's anything in this book that we've learned about King Ahasuerus is the guy likes to eat, and he likes to drink, and he loves to have banquets. He had 180 days worth of one to start the whole entire story. This guy likes to party. He especially likes parties that are thrown in his honor. So Esther is doing a double whammy here. She is flattering him, and then she goes on to tease him and lead him on. I mentioned earlier that when I read this part of the story, I often am like, Esther, come on, just tell him, all right? You've got the hook in there. He thinks you're gorgeous, right? He's already offering you half the kingdom. All you have to say is, don't kill the Jews, right? What are you doing? But apparently Esther is wiser than I am. She throws not one, but two parties for the king. And more than that, she's patient. And this patience builds suspense, not only in the story, but also in Ahasuerus. All right, she builds suspense. Just look at the text. It only takes her 4 verses. 4 verses, all right, to get offered half of Ahasuerus' kingdom. Half of the world, as the story goes. And she doesn't just get it offered once. She gets it offered twice in 4 verses. And she doesn't take it. Both times, what does she do? She says, that's okay. That's okay. Don't worry about that. I don't need anything. All I really want from you, come back tomorrow. Let me throw you another party. She doesn't ask for anything. Instead, she just gives Ahasuerus something, another banquet. She says, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. And then I will do as the king has said. If I'm Ahasuerus, I'm going to bed that night and I can't sleep because I'm wondering the whole time, what does Esther have up her sleeve? What's this party going to be like? All right? I've just offered to her the kingdom twice, and she won't take it. What is she going to ask? I'm enthralled. All right? I'm enthralled. This is a game to him, and he loves every second of it. He absolutely loves it. Talk about being wise as a snake. By the end of verse 8, Esther has the king literally eating out of her hand. She just got him. Again, we see a connection to Jesus. Jesus is always in the New Testament seemingly able to escape the traps of the religious leaders, the traps of even Pilate, the Roman leaders and everything like this. He's able to escape all the traps of the people who are in power, and he does it by being wily and wise and half the time changing the subject to where they can't even figure out how in the world he won, but he did. He's not mean, he's not evil, he's not coercive, he's not overbearing. He's smart and he's understanding. He realizes who he's dealing with. Jesus, just like Esther, knows the hearts and the minds of the people who are around him, and he uses that to his advantage, not to overpower them or coerce, but to show them a better way of being in the world. Earlier this year, I mentioned a surprising statistic. I mentioned a poll that Gallup, which is a polling group, had done, been running for decades, actually generations now, over 80-something years. And for the first time ever in the history of their polling, in the history of Gallup's polling, church membership, they said, in 2021, March 2021, this is the first time ever that they've done the polling, and they've realized that church membership in the United States had fallen under 50%, which means that less than half of Americans are going to church. Cool? This included not just, by the way, Christian churches, but it included religious people in general. Are you going to synagogue? Are you going to temple? Are you going to the mosque? Are you religious? Under 50%, first time ever in the history of Gallup's polling, probably in the history of the U.S. 50 years ago, 70%. So here's where we've come from. 50 years ago, 70% of people in the U.S. said they were religious. 70%. All right? Now that number has fallen below half. This is a huge drop. Huge drop. We should ask ourselves, who are these folks? Who are these folks? If we're going to be wise, this is what Esther is teaching, because if we're going to be wise, who are these folks? If wisdom is knowing the people around you, and it's understanding who they are, then wisdom will want to know what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing is, importantly, not people who hate God. These aren't folks who hate God. They're not folks who are anti-religion. When they've done these studies, they do more than just count out people. They're asking questions. What we're seeing are people who just simply aren't religious anymore. It's just maybe not in their DNA. They don't have God in their pantry. They don't cook with them. All right? This is kind of what it means. All right? When they answered those surveys, they'd come across the question, what is your religious affiliation? And they would have a number of options. And the one that more and more people have been choosing over decades is one that says none. They don't choose atheist. They don't choose agnostic. They don't choose Christian. They don't choose Buddhist. They don't choose Muslim. They don't choose Jewish. They choose none. These folks aren't necessarily angry or atheistic or anything like this. They just don't operate with the idea of God anymore, much less the idea of Jesus. It's not a part of their daily lives. It's not a part of their vocabulary, all right? These are the nuns. These are our neighbors. These may be you. There's another group, a related group, that we call less officially, it's starting to become an official term, the Duns. So we have the nuns and we have the Duns, D-O-N-E-S's. All right, the Duns are those who at one time grew up with or were part of a religious community. A lot of these folks may have been baptized as kids or went to temple, they went to mosque as kids or young adults, but now they've sort of left religion altogether. They've been there. They've done that idea, right? But they're no longer. This could be for a whole slew of reasons, and it is for a whole slew of reasons. But one of the biggest and most surprising discoveries here is that neither of these groups, neither the nuns nor the Duns, are in large measure anti-religion, like we said. They're not anti-religion. They're not anti-God. When asked what their views on the existence of God are, or on spirituality, or even the supernatural, like well, you could think ghosts, you could think angels, you think, God, most of them actually show quite a bit of interest. There's this huge interest, even a longing, we might say, a seeking for supernaturality, a seeking for the spiritual, a seeking even for the religious. In fact, listen to this. Barna did, another group like Gallup, Barna did a survey of what they called the most post-Christian cities in America. And what they found is that in the most secular, by numbers, city in America, Springfield, Massachusetts, that's what, apparently Springfield, Massachusetts, what they found in their study was 11% of the people there said that they didn't believe in God. Only 11% in the most secular city in America said that they didn't believe in God. Only 40% said faith wasn't important to their lives. So if you do the math, let's turn that around. This means that almost 90% of folks in the most secular city in America, all right, believe in some sort of deity, that there's a God or might possibly be or something like this. 90% in the most secular city in America, all right, believe in God. 60% of them say faith is important to them. 60% in the most secular city in America say faith is important. And get this, the survey also discovered that 53% of respondents had prayed to God just the week prior in the most secular city in America. 53%. If we took a poll here and I asked how many of you prayed to God in the most recent week, not outside of a church building, how many? That would be, I don't know, be a fun one. 53%, okay? One theologian studying these numbers said it sounded a whole lot like that these were people among whom God is already active and the Spirit is already moving. I can't agree more. There could be other explanations, but this seems to be a space in which God is moving and acting in the world. If what we're talking about here in the book of Esther is how we can live lives that are godly and wise in a world that doesn't necessarily follow God's ways, then the first thing we can learn here, the first step to wisdom that we see, is knowing who we're talking to. How are we wise? How can we be wise? We can know our people. It's understanding our neighbors, engaging with them in a way that makes sense out of who they are and what they actually believe and think and feel and desire. This is exactly what Esther does, and she does it really well. It helps, of course, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, it helps, of course, that Esther looks really good. This is a big part of the story. She's beautiful. This is actually, I think, chapter 5 saying part of her wisdom. Esther realizes that she has something to offer King Ahasuerus that nobody else does, and it's her beauty. Today, I'd say that this is grossly objectifying Esther. And I think in actuality, the story probably thinks that too. From day one, when we meet Esther, we're told she's amazingly beautiful and that it's her beauty that does so much for getting her to become queen. But the joke throughout the story is actually on King Ahasuerus here. All right, there's a subtext that goes on throughout this story of Esther of how her beauty, it will be her way in, but it's her way to take power. In the end, this is what will prove most decisive in turning the king and in saving her people. All she has to do is walk into his presence. All she has to do is step into that throne room, and the guy melts. Just seeing Esther gets Ahasuerus to offer her half of his kingdom. That's power. Now, why is this important? How does it translate to us today? I'm just going to take a step out on a limb here and say that the point Esther is trying to make for us today is not that we should be going around trying to seduce people with our looks. I don't think that's what's going on here. But there is something very true about the sheer attractiveness of the beautiful, of what is beautiful in the world. We are a people. We are a people as a whole. Humanity as a whole are a people that we're drawn to what is attractive. We're drawn to what is beautiful. And I'm not just or even mostly talking about physical features, not really. I'm talking about the beauty of a good story. I'm talking about the attractiveness of a selfless act. All right? The sheer brilliance of a life lived in a way that is jaw-dropping, that is simply unbelievable, but real nevertheless. There's a reason why we were so attracted when Uvalde happened to the teacher who sacrificed herself for those kids. That's what we wanted to be true for everybody. Because we realize instinctively that it's beautiful and it's good, even though it's painful. We know it. A guy named John Henry Newman once quipped that nobody is going to die to defend their answer to a difficult algebra problem. Like when you're in 8th grade math, right, and you do algebra, and you're like, no, I'm right. Are you going to die for that? If your buddy tells you you're wrong. No, nobody's going to die for a logical conclusion. What do we die for? All right? Why would we become martyrs? Why would that beautiful teacher shield her kids with her own body? Why do we go to war? When the British were working to gum up recruits, by the way, at the beginning of the First World War, the Great War, they didn't list out all the economic minutia that was important for fighting this war and what we need to do, because if we don't, then yada, 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 and you may see this decrease or this increase in taxes and stuff like this. No, they didn't say any of that. They said, hey, go for glory, go for honor, go for duty, go to be a man. It was mostly men. All right? They were like, this is your chance to show your manlyhood. Go to war. These aren't logical things. These are emotional things. These are passionate things. These are what we call beautiful things. It's passion, it's beauty that stirs our hearts more than anything. This is the big reason why the gospel of Jesus that we preach is first and foremost a story. It's a story. If you came to me and asked why I believe and think the way that I do, and I said, well, think of it logically. If sin leads to death, and if we're all sinners, then we all die, so we need God to save us from death. You want to be a Christian? It's not very powerful. You may be like, okay, your logic, cool. We got to work on your premises. Things like this are important. Okay. No, that doesn't really do a lot of work for me. Probably doesn't do a lot of work for you. Instead, what do? We tell a story. We talk about God becoming human, like us, to be with us, because God loves us, going all the way to hell, to death for us, goes into Gethsemane, weeps there, carries his cross up the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. Why do people go to see this? Not because it helps them with a logical solution, not because it helps them understand the truth, but because it gives some beauty, some passion to this. He carries his cross up this street in Jerusalem and then cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" on the cross before dying and breaking down the very gates of hell and defeating death itself. This is a story that has power because it's a story that is beautiful. I've said a lot of times that my favorite description of faith is seeing someone living a kind of life that is simply attractive. Attractive and good, and I want to know why. What leads them to live that kind of life? So many people, whether they were Christians or not, were fascinated by the life of Mother Teresa of Calcutta in India, right? They were fascinated by her because she spent so many years in abject poverty and this disgusting situations. They wanted to know why in the world she did that. Why would you help the poor like that in those conditions for so long, risking your life? When they see the beautiful life, when they saw that, they wanted to know why. What leads that kind of life? What goodness, what morality makes that beauty possible? And then what leads us, and then when we go there, that leads us to then wonder what truths undergird that morality. So we see something beautiful, and then we ask about it, and we say, oh, they're driven by a different thing in life. What causes them to be driven that way? And we see some truth. So we see beauty first. That leads us to goodness. That leads us to truth. Most of the time in our history, we've flipped that, and we said, what you need to know is just the truth. Let me tell you about the Trinity. And people just glaze over, right? Let me tell you about why I'm still in my marriage. That's a question people want to talk about. That's a question that leads people to think, there's something different here that I can't help but find attractive. Why? Why do you do that? What's different about that? Maybe the greatest thing Esther 5 has to tell us today is that we all can take up Esther's power. We all have that power because we all have something beautiful inside of us. We call that the Holy Spirit. We call it, we said earlier this morning, love. God the Father is the lover. God the Son is the beloved. God the Spirit is the love between them. It's the love among us. How do we take power? We live that love out. And when our friends and our neighbors and our world wonder where it comes from, how can you be selfless like Mother Teresa of Calcutta? How can you be selfless in the midst of a world that is literally driven by consumerism and individualism? And we can tell them, we can say that what we saw in Jesus was attractive, and we wanted it. What we saw in the folks who follow Jesus best, that was beautiful too, and we wanted it. We couldn't help ourselves. We wanted this beautiful life, and when we found it, we discovered not only is it beautiful, but it's good, and it's true. So let me ask you this morning, what do you find beautiful in Jesus? What do you find beautiful in the story? What do you find beautiful in your world? Begin there and take up the power of Esther. Amen.